Now, one thing that I've heard a lot of recently from a lot of everybody, including a lot of you, is that no one wants to work anymore. Isn't that what people are saying? No one wants to work anymore. That's the phrase that you hear all over the place. Is that no one wants to work anymore. It's a common Republican right-wing talking point that is meant to impugn the so-called shiftlessness of working class and poor people in this country. But guess what, folks? This is not a new refrain. This is not a new refrain. A great article from Market Watch actually talks about this, that this has actually been said. No one wants to work anymore has been said for 100 years, going back to 1894. The phrase has come back into vogue recently as a result of the so-called Great Resignation theory that arose as millions of people left the U.S. workforce during the COVID-19 pandemic. Government data showed that nearly 57 million Americans left their jobs in the 14-month period from January 2021 to February 2022, even as the country lifted COVID-era restriction, which was a 25% strike over the same period before the pandemic. It should be noted that many of these people have indeed come back to the labor force. In a survey last year from Limeade subsidiary Tiny Pulse, an employee engagement and culture feedback platform, more than 1 in 5 business leaders or human resources employees agreed with the statement that no one wants to work. Well, as it turns out, it is a gripe that is as old as time. University of Calgary professor and researcher Paul Ferry points out that newspapers and other publications have claimed that nobody wants to work anymore at least once a decade, every decade for the past century, going back to 1894. But even economists say the data does not back this up. At the same time, nearly 57 million Americans left their job between January 2021 and February 22. About 89 million people were hired, showing that many of the quitters had new jobs lined up or found work shortly after leaving their previous job. It was less of a great resignation and more of a great negotiation, as millions of employees quit their old jobs for better jobs that improved their quality of life by offering better pay and better benefits, like paid leave or more work-life balance, like the flexibility to work remotely. Who would have thought that if you give people more money and benefits, they might want to work for you? Who would have thunk it? People aren't resigning to sit on the sidelines, economist Robert Frick at the Navy Federal Credit Union in Virginia told Market Watch. They are resigning to take different jobs. Now, Enrique Lopez Lira, director of the low-wage work program at UC Berkeley Labor Center, noticed that after controlling for population growth and aging of the workforce, about 2 million workers were missing in the June 2022 jobs report compared with February 2022. It's not because people stopped wanting to work. 2/3 of these people are 65 years and older, which makes sense given that we were in a pandemic where older people took the greatest health risk. But the workforce has largely returned to its pre-pandemic workforce. So this does not support the idea that nobody wants to work anymore. What's worst is that in the months and the years since the pandemic began, a lot of employees actually increased the hours of work, which also runs contrary that nobody wants to work. Some reports show that due to working from home, workers are working more hours than ever before. The trend of working more hours per week is not even just unique to the United States. So in terms of how much work per week, the data also does not support the idea that no one wants to work. Lopez Lira went on to say that workers are quitting their job not to exit the workforce, but to find employment elsewhere, presumably with higher pay and better benefits. So it's not a great resignation. It is a great reshuffling. So perhaps a more precise idea is nobody wants to work in low quality jobs. Let me read that again. Nobody wants to work in low quality jobs, everybody. The U.S. has had periods of labor shortages before, including the 1960s and mid-1980s. According to a research paper published by the Brookings Institute that conducts research with the goal of coming up with new ideas to solve problems facing society at the national, global, and local level. But those labor shortages were short-lived. Americans return to the workforce because people have to make a living. Now, here's something that they don't tell you. The corporate media and a lot of people don't take into account. Real wages in this country reached their peak in 1973. Think about that. 1973. That's when real wages for the average man and woman reached their peak. You could take care of a family of 3 on the minimum wage in 1973. If you were a minimum wage worker in 1973, you can afford you, your wife or husband, and a child. Now in 2023, forgot the year I was in. In 2023, you could not afford a 1-bedroom apartment in 90% of the counties in America on the minimum wage. So you get all these boomers out here talking about, in my day, I worked in the summertime and I paid off my college debts. Yes. But guess why? Because the minimum wage was worth a lot more in the 1960s. In 1968, the minimum wage was $2.68. Adjusted for inflation, that is $24 today. $24. You are making the equivalent of $24 an hour in 1968. That's why you could afford to pay your way through college or buy a brand new car after working at the Dairy Queen, because you were making the equivalent of $24 in today money. Now, what's the minimum wage in 2023? It is $7.25. So basically, your grandchildren are making about a third of what you were making in the 1960s at Dairy Queen when they work at the Dairy Queen or they work at McDonald's or whatever. Also, the median house in 1973, when real wages were at their peak, $30,000. That was the median house in America. $30,000. You want to know how much the median house cost in 2023 is? In 2022 was, I'm sorry. $433,000. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. $433,000. Of course you had money. The rent in 1973 was $108. $108 in 1973. You want to know what the rent is in 2022, 2023? $2,000. Yes. This is when you add up everybody around the country, you know. Very specifically, annual average weekly wages. Average weekly wages for somebody living in 1973 was $873 a week. $873. That was the average weekly wages. Today, it's $813. It's actually lower. So today's minimum wage of $7.25. Let me see how much that would have been in 1968 by inflation calculator. Let's look this up really quick. $0.83. Making $7.25 today, which is the minimum wage, is the equivalent of making 83 cents in 1968. So a lot of you were making $2.68. That was the minimum wage in 1968. Now it is $7.25, which is the equivalent of 83 cents. 83 cents. And then people have the nerve to say people don't want to work anymore. Ridiculous. We'll be right back after these here on WLTH 1370 AM.